Hello everybody and welcome back to another celebrity face reading. My name is Taylor and today we will be looking at Adolf Hitler, dictator of Germany during the Second World War and one of the most famous and infamous figures to ever live. Well known, of course, for his leadership of Germany during the war, but also for his charisma and his ability to gain power over large groups of people using nothing but his own voice, which is why he is of such particular interest to me and to y'all. This video is being done in response to a comment on my last video by JackLauer1. Thank you for requesting this, and if you want to decide what my next celebrity face reading is going to be, leave a comment under this video. The most liked comment will decide my next video. And without any further ado, let's get right into it. Now we're going to start out by looking at his phenotype, which is the physical expression of his genetic heritage and his race. Now he's got clearly a mixed phenotype between the two main types of Germany, that is Nordid, found more in the north, and Alpinid, found more in the south. Now he leans more towards the Alpinid side because he is of course an Austrian. He is literally from the Alps. So we see that he has a broader and shorter head, he's got that darker hair, and that somewhat shorter, stockier stature. That's all Alpinid. But of course it's not a pure Alpinid. His nose is a little too long, his face a little too long as well, and of course those blue eyes, that's not an Alpinid trait. Those are all Nordid features. So he occupies this sort of middle zone between Nordid and Alpinid that we call sub-Nordid. Sub in this context simply meaning south of Nordid. And this is a very common type throughout Germany, Austria, France, along that zone where Northern Europe meets Central Europe and the Alps. It also looks like he has a bit of North Atlantid, especially with that unique pigmentation combination there, that stark jet black hair with those bright blue eyes. That's not a typical Alpinid or even sub-Nordid mixture. That's more of a North Atlantid type thing. So there's some sort of North Atlantid, possibly Celtic mixture in there. But of course it would be very distant in his past and in his ancestry, nothing recent there. So overall, very typical Austrian look, very typical South German look in general. Alright, with that out of the way, we are going to be looking now at his side profile, which will tell us about his temperament and inborn traits. Now, if we look at his side profile here, he's got a chin that is level with his brow, and his jawline goes by and large down and then out at an obtuse angle. So this means that he had a really intense energy of action. He was a long-term actor. He could really devote himself to a cause or to a project and really go at it for a long period of time with very little rest, and he was very devoted to that. However, he was not a long-term planner or thinker by and large. He had a much more impulsive, impatient intellect. We can tell this by looking at his forehead, which is slanted, not high up and not rounded. However, with that level chin and that jawline, that stabilizes him enough so that in general he was very willful, bossy, and commanding, and overall had that more choleric, leader-like approach. However, I think that slanting, sanguine forehead gave him much more of an edge in terms of being able to think on his feet, especially when it came to his speeches, which we'll talk more about later. Finally, I want to mention that he does have that curved bow-like shape to his side profile. That is the bow of melancholy, and that means that he had some added sensitivity, reactivity, imagination, creativity, and quickness of mind. Very fitting, of course, for an artist, or wannabe artist, I should say, maybe. Now, with his side profile and temperament out of the way, we are going to be looking at his face shape, which will tell us about his personality archetype and the broad strokes of his personality. As you can see here, in his youth, he had much more of a triangular Mercury face shape. That stands for the magician archetype, and that means that in his youth and growing up, he was a lot more sensitive, reactive. He wanted attention and adulation, and he wanted to be a creative type, wanted to be an artist. This face shape is very common for artists, performers, musicians, actors, comedians. So it makes sense that in his youth, when he was still trying to make it as an artist in Vienna and elsewhere, that he would have this face shape. But you can see as he goes on in life, that face shape quickly disappears and he goes to a much more diamond or heart-shaped face. That is the Venus face shape, and it stands for the diplomat archetype. This means that he is very interested in social causes, very concerned with loving and being loved, and he was very passionate, had a lot of practical intelligence. Now you might say loving and being loved, this guy was a dictator, he was a warlord, he was responsible for the deaths of millions. Well, not to be crass or glib, but love can make you do crazy things, including, in his case, love of country, love of folk, love of people. He didn't conquer and kill because he just hated people for no reason. He conquered and killed because he saw his neighbors, the Poles, the Jews, the Russians, as an impediment to the well-being of the German people. And so everything he did, as he perceived it, he did for Germany and for the German people. He does not have that rectangular Mars face shape of someone like Mussolini, a natural warlord and kind of thuggish sort of personality. He was a reformer by nature. He wanted to make the world perfect. He wanted to make the world beautiful. And in his case, he wanted to do so by getting rid of everything and everyone that he perceived as ugly and imperfect. And we can see that, like a typical diplomat or Venus type, he had a bit of a softer side. Even though he kept this sort of hidden in order to control his image, we can see that he liked animals. He passed anti-animal cruelty laws. He was a vegetarian. So clearly there's a lot more complexity going on here than the typical image of the raving lunatic madman just wanting to kill everybody. His motivations were obviously a lot more complex than that. Alright, with the broad strokes of his temperament and personality laid out, we are now going to get into his facial features, which will fill in the details of his personality. Now we're going to group these by their relevance to different aspects of his life. We're going to start out with his early life and his worldview and perception, how he gained his ideology and his view of the world. We're going to start off by looking at his eyes. Now, of course, the eyes are the windows of the soul. We use our eyes to perceive, and so they tell us the most about someone's perception and worldview. His eyes were almond-shaped, which means that he saw the world through the lens of his intellect. He was not so much a moral or emotional thinker as much as he was a cold, hard, and rational one. His eyes were also fairly hooded, which means that he had a sort of cold detachment in his worldview. He was able to view things from a distance and analyze rather coldly and calmly. Now, in contrast to this, underneath that sort of hooded layer, you can see that he has really thick eyelids, really thick upper eyelids especially. This shows that in spite of this more cold, rational, detached view, he still had an underlying need for human connection and intimacy. And we can sort of see this conflict at play, I think, in how his relationship with Eva Braun went down. He tried to keep their relationship kind of secret. He didn't actually marry her until right before they died. And I think that had to do with the conflict that you can see in his eyes right there. There's the hooded eyes sort of suppressing that thick upper eyelid that wants to go out and be expressive. And so I think it's possible that that conflict maybe forced him to sublimate that desire for intimacy and connection and popularity that he may have picked up while he had more of that Mercury face shape in his more artistic youth into charismatic speaking and political popularity and ruling Germany and eventually Europe as a dictator. However, even though he did want intimacy and connection, he was never particularly reliant or dependent on the approval of other people. Look at his ears. They're pretty wide splayed in any picture you can find of him, which shows that he had a lot of independence. He was very much an independent thinker, followed the beat of his own drum from a very young age throughout the rest of his life, and so his ideology was very self-determined, based heavily on his own life experiences, less so than by following the doctrine of someone who came before him. Another note with his ears is that they recess in the middle third, but bulge in the top and bottom thirds. This means that he had strong interest in abstract and intellectual matters, as well as in material, practical matters, but not so much in these social, emotional matters. Again, think back to Eva Braun and his relationship with her, sort of neglecting the romantic, familial, and emotional side of life in favor of promoting his ideological agenda and ensuring Germany's material dominance over Europe and the world. The last thing I'm going to say on his worldview, and especially his early life, is that we can see a pretty prominent worry line between his eyebrows, specifically on the left side of his face, right next to his left eyebrow, that vertical line there, that stands for some sort of strong worry or frustration in his personal life. Now, personally, from what I know about him, I think this probably reflects some sort of trauma stemming from the death of his mother when he was around 18. After that happened, he had to raise his younger siblings by himself. He went through a lot of struggles with that. He was very close to his mother, very much a mama's boy, and I think that that left a very strong impact on him, and you can see that literally marked on his face in that line right there. And speaking of the left side of his face, he does have a strong asymmetry to his face, not so much in the features, but very strongly in his facial expressions. If you isolate the left side of his face from any number of photos, you can see that he has a very intense look there. He's very passionate, almost incensed, angry in all of these pictures. His eyes are very expressive and emotive, and in physiognomy we know that the left side stands for the true self. So when you look at these pictures, you're looking at the real Hitler as he really was. Passionate, feeling very strongly, very emotional, very intense, and very driven towards his goals. Alright, now we're going to look at the features that are related to his most famous gift, his charisma, his speaking ability, the thing that catapulted him into power over all of Germany and Europe. How could this unassuming failed artist from Austria convince all of Germany to die for him in a war against the world? Well, it's an interesting case. He does not have the facial features typical of a big talker. He had a really small mouth, which means that by nature he was very quiet and reserved, very clammed up. To add on to that, his lips were very thin, both top and bottom lip. This means that he was not particularly expressive with his true thoughts and feelings to others, and even less so to himself. Look, the upper lip is fuller and thicker than the lower lip, which is barely even visible. That thin lower lip means that he was a bit out of touch with his own wants and desires. However, his upper lip, what we can see of it, has a very prominent cupid's bow. It's a heart-shaped upper lip. That is the Venus upper lip, and that means that when he did communicate with people, even if he wasn't really genuinely expressing what he truly felt or thought about an issue, he expressed it in a very warm, seductive, and smooth-talking style. People with a Venus upper lip are very silver-tongued. They can very easily convince people of things. And look at the space between his tragus and his antitragus in his ear. It's huge. This means that even if he didn't want to speak, or even if he wasn't really speaking from the heart, he had a great ability to speak, and he could really use words well. Finally, if we go back to look at his eyes, they protrude quite a bit. This means that he was good at speaking off the cuff. He wanted to be socially involved and to speak and be heard. Even if he wasn't that much of a big talker or an extrovert in social situations, he still put a lot of emphasis on his opinion being respected. And speaking of his communication and public presentation of himself, we can now look at the right side of his face, which in contrast to the left side, which told us about his private and personal self, the right side now tells us about his public and professional self. And we can see that in contrast to that very impassioned, angry, almost childlike in its rage left side, we can see that his right side is very stone cold. It's detached, aloof, quite aristocratic, and even contemptuous in its expression. This was the self that he built up over time and projected to others. But I believe that his greatest strength was that he didn't just use this public persona, he used both sides. He would start off a speech very professional, very soft-spoken, very aristocratic and high-minded, and then he would slowly, over time, unwrap that inner persona full of passion, anger, rage, fury, and he would slowly reveal more and more of that until by the end of the speech, he's reached a fever pitch and he's got the whole audience there with him on the same page. Now we're going to finish off by looking at the features that were relevant for his decision-making process. These features were of course very important because not only did his decisions affect his electoral success, but after gaining power, they affected the fate of Germany and then during the war, by extension, Europe and the world as a whole. Now his nose was very straight, which means that he was very cool-headed and rational in his disposition, and it was medium in length, meaning that he had a decently good balance between deep contemplation and quick action in his behavior. Now where he starts to get into trouble in his war planning is with his eyebrows. They're somewhat short, which means that he was a more spontaneous person than a long-term planner. He wanted to jump in and do things and get stuff done. Maybe even a bit impulsive. That straight and medium length nose is going to bounce that out a bit, but only to a certain extent. His eyebrows were pretty low set as well, which means that he was a very quick and decisive person who made a lot of snap judgments about people, plans, projects, and other things. Very quick to judge, no surprise there. But in spite of that, what might have worked in his favor when it came to managing the interests of people around him and working with them, whether it be his generals or the characters that surrounded him, people like Goering, Goebbels, Himmler, these other types, was that he had an almost perfectly neutral canthal tilt. This means that he was great at balancing his own interests with those of other people around him. He wasn't a super domineering figure necessarily, not like a Stalin or even a Mussolini. He was fairly conciliatory to an extent with those around him, but he knew where to stand his ground, and if you tried his patience one too many times, or if you crossed the line, or if you presented a threat to his power, you would end up with a long knife in your back. And this of course harkens back to his wide-splayed ears. At the end of the day, he was fundamentally a very independent, nonconformist person, and this affected his politics. You had the Führer principle, which was the principle in Nazi Germany that the Führer, Hitler, is law. He is the absolute sovereign and everything orbits around him. He was not in there to share power or listen to other people beyond what he thought they deserved. He was there to rule solo because as far as he was concerned, he was the only one who could do it right. And this independence combined with stubbornness that we can see from his straight across eyebrows and the flat bottoms of his earlobes might have been what eventually doomed him. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate on this topic. It's a huge can of worms that I'm not equipped to get into, but I will say that I've often heard people say that he maybe could have won the war or at least had a better shot had he listened to his generals more. Maybe not retreat from the gates of Moscow when he's about to defeat the Soviet Union to reinforce his flank in Kiev. And when I look at his face in terms of decision making, balanced for sure and able to make pretty good decisions, but ultimately very independent and very stubborn, that makes a lot of sense to me. Alright, well that concludes our face reading of Adolf Hitler. If you want to learn any more about face reading or physiognomy or get a reading done for yourself, check out my website, link is in the description. Comment which celebrity you want me to do a reading of next. This has been Taylor from Prosopa Insights reminding you to always judge a book by its cover. Thank you for watching.
Okay.